Welcome once again. Thank you very much for showing up to this digital version of the Alumni Festival. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you about some recent research we've been doing on the evolutionary origins of modern birds. There are many people that I'd like to thank. I'll do so at the end, but this work has been made possible by the generosity of the Department of Earth Sciences here at Cambridge, funding support from UK Research and Innovation, as well as the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences and the Museum of Zoology here at Cambridge. So thank you very much to all of them. So I am a lecturer in the Department of Earth Sciences, but I'm a pretty unusual lecturer in Earth Sciences because the subject that I tend to study more than anything else is this, the evolutionary diversification of living birds. And the reason I'm interested in birds is that in the present day, birds are the most diverse group of living tetrapod animals. There are nearly 11,000 living species. And as you can see from this very small smattering of extant bird diversity, they come in an incredible variety of shapes and sizes and colors. So I'm an evolutionary biologist and paleontologist, and I'm fascinated by birds because they provide so many interesting evolutionary questions and mysteries to unravel. So as I mentioned, I'm a paleontologist, and most of the data that I tend to work with will look something like this. The data come from the fossil record, and we're interested in discovering new fossil evidence from the fossil record of birds to give us a clearer understanding about how and when and why modern bird biodiversity has arisen. But unlike many paleontologists, my background is in biology, and I like to spend a lot of time in the field observing and photographing wild birds because I think this is a great way to come up with interesting evolutionary hypotheses, which we can then try to test with direct evidence from the fossil record. So for anyone who's actually deeply interested in bird evolutionary biology, the last 10 years have been very, very exciting because it's really only over the last 10 years or so that we've made major strides towards understanding how the major living groups of birds are related to one another. And after much work based on advances in genomic sequencing methods and computational methods, we've come closer than we've ever been before to generating a comprehensive picture of the bird family tree. So this diagram you see here at the bottom of the screen is basically a family tree uniting the major lineages of living birds. So there are about 200 major lineages of birds here, representing the entire diversity of the modern bird tree of life. As I mentioned, close to 11,000 living species. And it's really only in the last few years that we've gotten to a point in our understanding of bird evolution that we've been able to build a family tree like this. Now, one of the interesting things about this family tree is that we can use information from the fossil record to understand how deep in time these branches in the family tree go. So if you look at all of these different lineages across modern bird diversity, you can imagine that across this tree, there are lots of fossil representatives that we've discovered that give us a sense of when in Earth history many of these major lineages originated. And so we can use the ages of fossils that we've discovered in order to calibrate rates of genetic change across this family tree and thereby scale this bird family tree to time. So if you look at the vertical axis of the tree, this family tree is scaled to time. I understand that those numbers are a little bit small, but if you trace sort of the distance along this bird family tree from the very tips in the present day at the top of the tree down to the bottom, we think that that's a journey of about 75 million years. We think the last common ancestor of living birds lived around 75 million years ago. So with that sort of temporal perspective on the bird family tree in mind, some interesting patterns can jump out at us. So if we look down towards the bottom of the family tree, you might notice that around one point in time in particular, right near the bottom of the tree, several deep divergences within this family tree seem to have taken place in relatively rapid succession. So I'll highlight that portion of the tree with a red line. And that's the part of the tree that I'm talking about, where it seems like numerous major branches seem to have branched very, very rapidly. And that red line corresponds to a very interesting point in the evolutionary history of birds, and in fact, a very interesting point in the history of our planet, about 66 million years ago. And so that point in time corresponds with one of the most important events in the entire history of life on Earth, which is when a giant asteroid struck the Earth close to what is currently the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and initiated the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. So this mass extinction event, also called the KPG or Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction event, is one of the most severe mass extinction events the history of life has ever witnessed. And to give you a sense of how enormous the catastrophe we're actually talking about, we can think of some recent catastrophes that might place this event into context. So I'm sure everybody listening saw footage of the horrendous explosion that struck Beirut last month. This is one of the most severe human-induced explosions in the history of our planet. And of course, the damage was absolutely catastrophic. So estimates of the destructive power of that explosion have suggested that the explosion unleashed an equivalent amount of energy to the detonation of about 1,500 tons of TNT. So this was a massive explosion, and as we saw, it destroyed much of a major contemporary city. By contrast, if we think about the amount of energy that was imparted onto the planet from this asteroid impact 66 million years ago, it's been estimated that the energy imparted onto the planet by the asteroid impact was roughly equivalent to 100 trillion tons of TNT. So if there are any mathematicians listening in the audience, I could very well be wrong with my mathematics here. But if I'm correct, we're talking about a factor of 67 billion times. So the impact at the end of the Cretaceous imparted by this bolide strike near the Gulf of Mexico was easily one of the most catastrophic events to afflict this planet in its history. So to provide a little more information about this end Cretaceous asteroid impact, we think that this celestial body that slammed into the Earth was tens of kilometers in diameter, somewhere between about 10 and 80 kilometers in diameter. And we think that it was traveling at enormous speeds, approximately 20 kilometers per second. And in fact, even though this impact occurred 66 million years ago, we can still observe, with the aid of geophysical imaging, the actual crater that this asteroid impact left behind. And this is the crater that is about 150 kilometers in diameter and 20 kilometers deep, buried deep beneath millions of years worth of sediment and water overlapping the northern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula and the Gulf of Mexico. So this talk is primarily about birds, so let's get back to that. There's no question that this asteroid impact was absolutely catastrophic. It drove the complete extinction of numerous formerly successful groups all around the world, including all of the giant dinosaurs, as well as numerous other lineages of major vertebrates that were around, such as the flying pterosaurs, the flying reptiles from the age of dinosaurs, as well as giant marine lizards like mosasaurs and other giant marine reptiles like the long-necked plesiosaurs. But the question of how this asteroid impact influenced bird evolution is a question that we really haven't had a clear answer to until relatively recently. So you'll recall from that first family tree that there seems to be evidence based on the antiquity of the modern bird family tree that this mass extinction event may have stimulated the relatively rapid diversification of modern birds in the extinction's aftermath. But what sort of actual direct evidence do we have from the fossil record that might tell us about the influence of this mass extinction event on birds themselves? Well, this is a question that we really didn't know the answer to until about 10 years ago, when we decided to survey the latest Cretaceous fossil record of birds, so the fossil record of birds from the very end of the age of dinosaurs, and the very earliest fossil record of birds from the Cenozoic, which is the period of time immediately following the age of dinosaurs, which began 66 million years ago and continues today. We're 66 million years hence, but we're still in the Cenozoic era. So we decided to survey the fossil record of birds from the latest Cretaceous and the earliest Cenozoic in as much detail as we could. And when we started our work, all we really knew about the influence of the mass extinction event on birds was that we had several lineages of archaic bird-like forms outside of modern bird diversity that disappeared at some point in the relatively late part of the Cretaceous. But we did not know exactly when those lineages went extinct. But after surveying the fossil record from the latest part of the Cretaceous, we found that in fact all of these major lineages of Cretaceous, archaic, pre-modern birds persisted through the latest part of the age of dinosaurs up to the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, which is the layer laid down coincident with the asteroid impact, after which point those fossils are never recovered from the fossil record again. So it seems indeed like this mass extinction event drove the complete annihilation of these archaic bird-like forms, and we think that only the very earliest ancestors of modern birds, the group that we call Neornithes, managed to sneak across this mass extinction event. So from the survey of the fossil record, it seems pretty clear that birds were impacted very severely by the end Cretaceous mass extinction event, which raises several very interesting questions. The first of those questions is, which lineages of modern birds actually managed to survive this global catastrophe 66 million years ago? Secondly, how did those lineages manage to survive, especially in light of the fact that all of these close relatives of modern birds from outside living bird diversity went extinct? And finally, from a more ecological perspective, what happened to habitats around the world that birds are dependent on, such as forests, in the aftermath of the mass extinction event? So these are all questions that we became very interested in addressing following this initial study. So with regard to the question of which modern bird lineages actually managed to sneak across the KPG boundary and survive into the earliest part of the Cenozoic, we can focus in on this portion of the bird family tree right down at its very bottom, where we're looking at the very earliest stages of the modern bird radiation. So we can zoom in on that portion of the tree and try to understand which lineages we're actually talking about there. So we think that as few as 3 or 4 major lineages of modern birds actually managed to survive across the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary and ultimately give rise to the ancestors of all birds that are alive today. So those lineages include this lineage highlighted in yellow, the ancestral lineage that ultimately has given rise to ostriches and their relatives, as well as this lineage here, which gave rise on the one hand to this lineage that leads to chicken-like birds and duck-like birds, which is a group that we call altogether Galloanserae in the present day, as well as this lineage, which leads to a group that we call Neoaves, which represents all other living birds. So we think only the very, very early ancestors of these major lineages managed to persist across the end Cretaceous mass extinction event and give rise to this rapid diversification event in the earliest part of the Cenozoic. We think that only a handful of modern bird lineages survived. But that doesn't really tell us how those lineages survived. So what was the secret that helped modern birds make it across this mass extinction event? Well, work that we've done quite recently has suggested that one of the keys to modern bird survival 66 million years ago was being small-bodied. So obviously, being small confers certain advantages. Smaller bodied organisms have lower total metabolic requirements than larger bodied organisms. So in fact, across many mass extinction events, there seems to be selection for relatively small bodied organisms. And this has led to the coining of a new term in the last 20 years called the Lilliput effect, which references this propensity for relatively small bodied lineages to survive through mass extinction events. So when we look at the bird fossil record and perform some statistical reconstructions of body size evolution 66 million years ago, we see relatively strong support for the idea that the surviving lineages of birds to make it through the mass extinction event were substantially smaller than their pre-extinction antecedents. And this is a very interesting thing to keep in mind when you think about some of those major lineages on Earth that disappeared 66 million years ago, like the large dinosaurs, like these giant marine reptiles, and like the pterosaurs. In fact, in terrestrial environments on land, nothing larger than really a small cat survived anywhere in the world. So we think that this was an extinction event that was truly and very strongly size selective. And it's in light of that, it's really not such a surprise to see that there seems to be a strong signal supporting the idea that surviving lineages of modern birds were relatively small. But what actually happened to the habitats that birds are dependent on 66 million years ago? Obviously, this asteroid impact would have had global effects. And so how did it actually influence the habitats that birds live in? Well, we had an idea a few years ago that global deforestation, which might have been caused by the asteroid impact, would have acted as a selective filter against the survival of tree-dwelling birds 66 million years ago. But what do we know about global deforestation related to the KPG boundary? Well, I'm going to show you a little simulation, so hopefully this video will play in the bottom left. And this is a simulation of what might have happened to the Earth's surface in the hours following the asteroid impact 66.02 million years ago. So those growing areas in orange are areas of the surface of the Earth that are estimated to have been heated above the temperature at which vegetation will spontaneously combust. So this is a product of basically the superheated debris that was ejected from the impact site itself, re-entering the atmosphere and settling down across the surface of the planet. So this observation, as well as abundant evidence from the fossil record of pollen, has suggested very strongly that global wildfires induced by the asteroid impact appear to have caused a global devastation of forests all around the world. On top of that, the fine scale particles that are thought to have been ejected into the atmosphere are thought to have dimmed the penetration of sunlight through the Earth's atmosphere for several years following this mass extinction event, which of course would have had an effect on photosynthesis and would have further made it difficult for forests to survive this mass extinction event unscathed. So how would this global deforestation have influenced birds 66 million years ago? Well, interestingly, by far the most diverse and globally widespread group of bird-like animals that was around before the extinction event were a group that we call the opposite birds. And the opposite birds had feet that looked like this, characterized by elongated hind toes and strongly recurved claws, which are features that in the present day are strongly associated with perching in trees. So this group, the enantiornithines, or the opposite birds as they're more easily referred to as, have long been thought to have been denizens of the forests. And so the fact that global forests seem to have been devastated in the aftermath of the extinction event leads one to think that the fact that enantiornithines, or opposite birds, went extinct 66 million years ago was probably related to this global deforestation. On top of that, by looking at the modern bird family tree and performing some statistical analyses, it's very clear that the surviving lineages of modern birds, those ancestral lineages leading to ostrich-like birds, duck-like birds, and chicken-like birds, and the other early ancestors of surviving lineages, all appear to have been ground-dwelling birds. So we have zero evidence to suggest that any tree-dwelling birds managed to survive across the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. So we think that a very important factor influencing the survivorship of birds 66 million years ago was a tendency to live on the ground instead of in trees. So all of this work from the last 10 years or so has left us with three key hypotheses governing our understanding of what probably happened to birds in the aftermath of the mass extinction event. First of all, we think that only the earliest ancestors of modern birds probably survived into the Cenozoic. We think that any surviving lineages must have been relatively small-bodied. And we also think that any surviving lineages probably were not tree-dwelling birds. The problem, however, is that the fossil record of early modern birds from the end of the age of dinosaurs is extremely sparse, which has limited our ability to directly test any of these major hypotheses. So there's still a lot that we have yet to learn, and it all requires the discovery of new fossil evidence of modern birds from the end of the age of dinosaurs. And that leads me to what I'd really like to talk to you about today, which is the discovery of a new fossil bird from the end of the age of dinosaurs that seems to answer many of these long-standing questions about what happened to birds when their giant dinosaur cousins went extinct. So the fossil that I'm going to talk to you about today admittedly is not a very exciting looking fossil at first. As you can see in that photograph, it's a very small fossil. That's a 20 pence piece perched on top of it. So this is a block of rock that's only a few centimeters long by a couple of centimeters wide by a couple of centimeters deep. And more than that, the fossil looks really, really ugly. This is hardly the fossil that you would expect to be the holy grail that might answer some of these key questions about bird evolution. But let's not rule it out quite yet. I'll orient you to give you a sense of what we're seeing first. So that broken bone that you see on top of the block is the thigh bone or the femur of a bird. You can see it's quite busted up. There's some bones poking out right beneath that femur. Those are fish bones that are not very well preserved and actually not all that exciting, especially if you really want to find bird bones. But if we take this block and we rotate it around, I was trying really hard to keep my hand steady when I was filming this video. We can see the underside of the block, and we see another broken leg bone there. That is the shin bone, which in birds is called the tibiotarsus. Okay, so this is a very ugly looking fossil. It seems to contain only 2 bird bones, a broken thigh bone and a broken shin bone. Big deal. How can this really tell us all that much about the evolution of birds 66 million years ago? Well, we decided to look more closely at this fossil simply because the bird fossil record really is so sparse from the end of the age of dinosaurs. So even a couple of broken limb bones are better than nothing. More importantly, even than that, is that the fossil comes from relatively close to here. You can see the fossil locality highlighted on that map. This is a fossil that comes from eastern Belgium, just along the border with the Netherlands. So this is one of the very few fossils of bird-like forms that we know of from the age of dinosaurs from Europe. So it's potentially interesting for that reason as well. But the importance of the fossil really becomes clear when we look at this stratigraphic column that represents the rocks exposed in eastern Belgium and the southern part of the Netherlands. So this star down at the bottom gives you a sense of the age of this fossil. It's somewhere between 66.8 and 66.7 million years old. So that obviously places it right towards the end of the age of dinosaurs, because the asteroid impact occurred at 66.02 million years ago. So for a geologist, this interval of a few 100,000 years is really the blink of an eye and gives us some really nice insight into bird fossils from the end of the age of dinosaurs that we didn't know before. So because this fossil came from such an important point in time, we decided to investigate it very closely. And we're extremely lucky here at Cambridge, because Cambridge, in the basement of the University Museum of Zoology, has the Cambridge Biotomography Center, which is a high-resolution micro-CT scanning facility that allows us to generate extremely high-resolution images of fossils like this one. And because this machine produces very high-powered X-rays, it can actually allow us to peer inside the rock to see if there might be anything interesting that's not necessarily visible from the surface. So let's see, this was December 2018. It was about a month after I started my position in the Department of Earth Sciences. I was really getting, it was actually my first visit to the Cambridge Biotomography Center. I brought this little fossil from Belgium down there to CT scan it. And we really didn't know what to expect. Our expectations weren't very high. We thought maybe at least we'd be able to get a clearer look at those broken leg bones and see if we could say something interesting about them. So I did this CT scan with Keturah Smithson, who is the technician who runs the Cambridge Biotomography Center, as well as my PhD student, Juan Benito, who joined me in the research on this specimen. And what you'll see is a video giving a sense of what we first saw when we received our CT scan data that allowed us to peer inside the rock. So that blurry white cloud that you see on the screen, that is a digital rendering of the outer surface of the fossil. And with our CT scanning processing software, we're able to digitally remove the rock. So I'll play this video and you can get a sense of what we first saw in December 2018, which to our amazement, that's Juan Benito there, included a nearly complete skull hidden within this tiny rock. I almost fell out of my chair. This was the most exciting moment of my scientific career, because as I've mentioned several times now, birds from the end of the age of dinosaurs are very rare, and we don't have any modern bird skulls from the age of dinosaurs at all. So after many months of work, we were able to generate much nicer looking CT scan images of the specimen. So what you're looking at again here is the outer surface of the fossil. That broken thigh bone is on the bottom. And we can digitally remove the rock in order to show that skull hidden underneath. And after many hundreds of hours of hard work extracting in 3 dimensions the anatomy of this skull, we were left with this. The only fossil bird skull known from a modern bird from the age of dinosaurs so far. And as you'll see, an extremely well-preserved fossil bird skull indeed. So I'm going to spin it around there to give you a look at the anatomy that is preserved. And I'll give you a bit of a look at some of the anatomy that we have here. So there's clearly quite a lot of the skull here, which includes most of the major architectural components of this fossil skull. So I'll highlight some of the important ones. Over on the left in red, we have a bone called the premaxilla, which is a bone that forms the upper beak in modern birds. In yellow, we have the nasal bones, which, as you can see, bound the posterior portion of the nostrils. In pink, we have the frontal bones, which basically would have overlain the front portion of the brain. And in blue, down at the bottom, we have the lower jaws. In addition to those elements, we have many other components of the skull that are very, very rarely preserved in fossil bird skulls, because bird skulls themselves are extremely lightweight and fragile, and typically are never found preserved in this much detail in 3 dimensions. So with that, I'll spin the skull around one more time. And we can start to look at some of the key features of the skull that tell us just how interesting it is. So these arrows in white point to features that allow us to recognize it as a modern bird, a member of the living bird radiation. So those include the fact that the upper bill, the premaxilla, is toothless like that of a modern bird. Interestingly, the closest relatives that we know of modern birds from the age of dinosaurs that are outside of modern bird diversity still retain teeth. So teeth are a feature that were lost very late in modern bird evolutionary history. At the tip of the lower jaw in blue, you can see that the jaws are fused together, the left and right jaws. That's another feature that allows us to recognize this as a modern bird. And at the back of the lower jaw, we see that this jaw lacks an element called the coronoid bone, which is another feature of modern birds. But not only are there all of these features of modern birds distributed across the skull, there are features of certain subgroups of modern birds that allow us to figure out what kind of modern bird we're actually dealing with here. So as I was mentioning before, the name that we give to the modern bird group is Neornithes. But what Neornithine subgroup does this skull belong to? Well, you can see this posteriorly projecting mustache-like portion of the premaxilla. That's an important feature, as well as this inverted comma-shaped structure at the back of the lower jaw, as well as this feature of the quadrate bone, as well as another immediately projecting portion of the lower jaw. So all of those features are very important because those are features that we see in one particular subgroup of living birds in the present day. And that is a group of birds that we call Galloanserae. Now, I'll talk about Galloanserae more in a minute, but we decided to name this new fossil Asteriornis. So we named it after the Greek goddess Asteria, who's the goddess of falling stars. We thought that was apropos because the fossil comes from only a few 100,000 years before the asteroid impact. And the specific name that we assigned to Asteriornis was Maastrichtensis, referencing the fact that the fossil came from near Maastricht in the Netherlands in rocks that are known as the Maastricht Formation. So what are Galloanserae? We think the fossil belongs to a group called Galloanserae. Well, we can break down the name a little bit into Gallo, which references a living group called Galliformes, which are chickens and their relatives, as well as Anserae, which references the living group Anseriformes, which are ducks and their relatives. And so we think the fossil comes from close to the point in bird evolutionary history where the chicken-like birds diverged from the duck-like birds. So if we focus in on the bones of the front portion of the skull, including the beak, there are numerous important similarities that we see with chicken-like birds, with Galliformes. Now, interestingly, if we look at the posterior portion of the skull, there are numerous important similarities that we see in the fossil Asteriornis shared with living duck-like birds. So in some ways, this new skull looks almost like what would happen if you took the front part of a chicken-like bird skull and smashed it together with the back part of a duck-like bird skull. We've simply never seen anything quite like this before. So, as I mentioned, this fossil comes from close to the last common ancestor of the chicken-like birds and the duck-like birds. And it goes without saying that these are important economically and culturally groups of birds in the present day. So this group over on the left, the Galliformes, today is represented by about 300 living species, including ducks and turkeys and quails, as well as some more obscure forms that we're not familiar with here in the UK, things like mound builders from Australasia and guans and curassows from the neotropics. And then over on the anseriform side, of course, ducks, geese, and swans are all familiar to us today, but anseriformes also includes some more obscure forms that live far away from here, like the screamers, which you can see on the upper left of the anseriform image. Those live in South America in the present day, and the magpie goose, over on the right, lives only in Australia. So we think the fossil comes from close to the last common ancestor of Galliformes. So does that corroborate our idea that any modern bird fossil from the end of the age of dinosaurs should come from deep within the modern bird family tree? Well, here, if we look at our modern bird family tree and we point over to the lineage where chicken-like birds and duck-like birds last shared a common ancestor, we see that that lineage is highlighted there in red. And indeed, it is one of the deepest lineages within the modern bird tree of life. And we can see right there, if we superimpose the position of the KPG boundary, that this is one of the very few branches that we did think beforehand should have been present at the end of the age of dinosaurs. It's one of the very few branches that does cross the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. So we can indicate where Asteriornis probably sits on the family tree right there along that lineage that represents the shared lineage of chicken-like birds and duck-like birds about 66.7 or 66.8 million years ago. So it does indeed seem to corroborate this idea that modern bird evolutionary history was only in its earliest stages when the asteroid struck. But does it corroborate our expectation that any bird surviving the mass extinction event should be pretty small? Well, what we're looking at here is a body size distribution chart for living duck-like birds in blue and chicken-like birds in green. So to orient you, we'll place a very large living duck-like bird, a mute swan, on this diagram, occupying that upper right portion of this plot. And to orient you with some other familiar species, that's a green-winged teal over on the left and a gray partridge in the middle. Those are both birds that live around here in the present day, live around Cambridge in the present day, and both weigh about 395 or so grams on average. That makes green-winged teals one of the smallest living duck-like birds, and it's also relatively small for living chicken-like birds. And in fact, that is the same body mass that we estimate for the fossil Asteriornis based on scaling relationships of the hind limb bones. So we think that Asteriornis would have weighed in the range of about 395 grams, which places it amongst the smallest living representatives of duck-like birds and chicken-like birds, and well within the body size thresholds for avian survivors that we would expect to have made it across the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. So yes, indeed, Asteriornis is a relatively small-sized bird, much smaller than most avian victims that do not seem to persist across the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. So for context, here's a picture of me holding a life-size 3D replica of the skull of Asteriornis. It's about 4 centimeters long. And you can see this is really not an enormous bird at all that we're talking about. But was it a ground-dwelling bird? Well, I mentioned before that there were some ugly hind limb bones preserved alongside the skull. It's true that the hind limb bones were not very well preserved, but in additional blocks that were found alongside the skull, we discovered additional hind limb fragments that allow us to estimate the proportions of the three major hind limb bones, the thigh, the shin, and the foot. And these bones seem to be quite elongate and gracile and very, very narrow. So these are features that in the present day are often associated with living on the ground and are often associated with shore-dwelling habits. And that's very interesting considering that the fossil comes from rocks that were laid down in near-shore marine sediments. So given the environmental context that the fossil comes from, and given the proportions of the hind limbs of this bird, we think that it's very possible that the ecology of Asteriornis may have been somewhat similar to that of a living shorebird or wading bird, very different from the ecology of any living chicken-like birds and most living duck-like birds. Seemingly corroborating the expectation that surviving lineages of birds across the end Cretaceous mass extinction event were likely to have been ground dwellers. So this is an artist's reconstruction of the paleo environment that Asteriornis would have lived in 66.7 million years ago. There's a rotting mosasaur there on the back. We have the toothed archaic bird-like forms that went extinct at the end Cretaceous mass extinction event, feeding on that dead mosasaur. Those are relatives of Ichthyornis, early bird-like forms from the age of dinosaurs. You have a washed-up ammonite on the beach. So these three key hypotheses that we came in with, that any surviving lineages of birds were probably very early in modern bird evolutionary history, that any surviving lineages of birds were probably small-bodied across the KPG mass extinction event, and that these lineages would have been non-tree dwelling. All of these ideas seem to be corroborated by this fossil Asteriornis mastrictensis, giving us some confidence that yes, indeed, we're starting to form a more complete picture of what bird evolutionary history was really like 66 million years ago when this asteroid struck the Earth. But it can also tell us some other very interesting things as well. And one of the most interesting features of this fossil is simply the fact that it comes from very close to where I'm speaking to you right now. We can drive to the fossil locality from Cambridge under normal circumstances, COVID willing, in about half a day. As I mentioned, this fossil locality is in the eastern part of Belgium. So why is that so interesting? Well, in the present day, bird biodiversity is not evenly distributed around the world. This is unfortunate for us in the Northern Hemisphere, because here in this hemisphere, we only have three major groups of birds that are restricted to the northern land masses and are not found on the southern land masses. And these include the auks or alcids, which include famous representatives like puffins, as well as razorbills and guillemots. So those are shown on the upper right. They include divers. In North America and in Canada, where I'm from, we call them loons. They're just a handful of living species of loons only found, in the Northern Hemisphere. And on the bottom left, we have a small group of birds called toadies, which are restricted to the Greater Antilles in the Caribbean right now. They're not particularly widespread. By contrast, there are a huge number of avian groups that are restricted or predominantly restricted to the southern land masses, such as the Neotropics, the Afrotropical biogeographic zone, as well as Australasia. And so the fact that we have such unevenly distributed living bird diversity on the planet today long led to the assumption that modern birds themselves probably originated in the southern hemisphere. But some recent fossil discoveries have really cast doubt on that interpretation. For example, this is an image of a fossil called Phoropinarium that we published on a couple of years ago. Phoropinarium comes from the Western United States, from the state of Wyoming. And we think that Phoropinarium is an early representative of a living group of birds called turicos. So those are turicos illustrated on the right. And as you can see, they're amazing, very charismatic and colorful looking birds that are restricted to sub-Saharan Africa in the present day. So the fact that we find an early representative of turacos in North America from about 52 million years ago suggests that early in the evolutionary history of the turaco lineage, that lineage was much more widespread than living turacos are in the present day. And this is not a one-off either. In fact, when we look at the fossil record of birds from the last 50 or so million years, over and over again, we see these patterns where the modern representatives of groups are found in one part of the world, but their fossil relatives are found in another. So if we look at this group over on the left called rollers, a beautiful group of birds that today is distributed only in the old world, we find that their early fossil representatives come from North America. The opposite is true for hummingbirds. Of course, we don't have hummingbirds in Europe today, sadly. In the present day, hummingbirds are only found in North and South America, but their early fossil record comes from Europe. And mouse birds, this group over on the right, show a very similar pattern to what we just described in turacos, whereby the living diversity of mouse birds, 6 living species, are only found in sub-Saharan Africa, but they actually turn out to have a very rich early fossil record from the Northern Hemisphere in both North America and Europe. So clearly, the geographic distributions of major groups of living birds appear to have fluctuated greatly through Earth history, and the present-day geographic distributions of many of these major groups may not give us a good indication of where those groups actually originated. So an important point to take away from this is that only the fossil record can tell us with confidence where these major groups of birds were formerly found. So the fact that this very important early modern bird fossil, which happens to be the oldest modern bird fossil ever discovered so far, comes from Europe, suggests that perhaps the early evolutionary history of birds themselves did not take place in the Southern Hemisphere, and it bodes well for the future discovery of early modern bird fossils from places like Europe and North America. So hopefully in the coming years, we'll be able to share additional fossil discoveries of modern birds from these parts of the world with you. So with that, I'd like to wrap up by filling in the blanks on this reconstruction here. There's a beautiful painting prepared by an American artist named Philip Krasminski depicting Asteriornis in its late Cretaceous shoreline habitats in tropical Europe from 66 million years ago. And wrap up by letting you know that if you'd like to learn even more about Asteriornis and some of the work that we've been up to right now, we've prepared an online museum exhibit. You can hopefully find this link here when you check out the YouTube video afterwards, and or you can navigate to this Dawn of the Wonderchicken online museum exhibit by going to the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences website and navigating from there. But I have even more exciting news to share with you, which is that today, under strict social distancing protocols, the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences here at Cambridge is open. So if you're interested in visiting the Sedgwick Museum, you can see the physical version of the Dawn of the Wonderchicken exhibit in person. The actual fossils themselves are on display. We're very excited that this exhibit has finally opened up after a long COVID-related delay. So if you're interested in visiting the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences, admission is free as always. You just have to book tickets in advance, and to do that, just go to the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences website and book your tickets from there. So with that, there are many people that I'd like to acknowledge for their assistance with this work, far too many to mention, but I'd particularly like to highlight the co-authors on this work, which include 2 PhD students from my research group here at Cambridge, Juan Benito and Albert Chen, as well as John Yacht, who's the curator from the Natural History Museum in Maastricht, who loaned this specimen to us, as well as my good friend and colleague, Dan Sepka from the Bruce Museum in Connecticut. So with that, I'd like to remind everyone that there is a Q&A session right now. So if you do have questions, I'm going to minimize my screen. I'll stop sharing these slides and I'll do my best to answer the questions now. So thank you very much for your attention and for hanging around to listen to this talk. And I'm opening up the Q&A session now, and I'm seeing that there are quite a few questions in there. So I'm going to get started from the top, which is a question from Tim, who asks, what's the degree of agreement between the fossil record and I'll paraphrase the question a little bit. What's the degree of agreement between estimates for the antiquity of modern birds from these molecular divergence time analyses that we talked about and the fossil record? Are these calibrating each other? Well, our understanding of, Tim, our understanding of the antiquity of modern birds is dependent very heavily both on the outcome of molecular divergence time analyses and information from the fossil record. So fossils are used to calibrate rates of genetic change in these molecular divergence time analyses. And we're very interested in the tendency for discrepancies to arise between molecular divergence time results and the fossil record. So we've been working very hard over the last few years to reconcile age estimates for modern birds from the fossil record and molecular divergence time analyses. And that has led us to some ideas for how to parameterize molecular divergence time analyses in more sophisticated ways. But the general impact of those results is that our estimates for the age of modern birds as a group has gotten much, much younger. So early estimates had hypothesized that modern birds might have originated 100 million years ago or even older. But as I mentioned, our recent work has suggested an age for the last common ancestor of modern birds at around 75 million years. And that's in much better agreement with the fossil record than previous estimates. Thank you for that question. Stuart asks, what makes a modern bird modern? In other words, how is modern defined? So that's a great question. And to answer it, we need to think back to those family trees of birds that we were looking at before. So when I use the word modern, we're talking about something defined in terms of that family tree. So a modern bird, the technical term for modern that I'm using is crown group bird. And we define crown group birds as the very last common ancestor of all living birds, and then all of that ancestor's descendants. So we think the last common ancestor of crown group birds or modern birds lived about 75 million years ago. Probably only a handful of crown group birds survived across the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction event. And today we have over 11 or close to 11,000 living species of crown birds with us. Okay, so Adrian asks, while she is wondering, he or she is wondering if there was a similar mass extinction event at the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum 55 million years ago. That's a great question. The answer is no, but the influence of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum on bird biology is not very well understood. And I think that's a really fascinating thing to try to delve into in more detail. So for those who don't know, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum was the point in the history of the Cenozoic, so the last 66 million years, when Earth's surface temperatures were at their hottest. This is a point in time where, you know, all the way into the Arctic, we had things like crocodilians and palm trees. And that is a very interesting point in time for bird evolution, because a lot of the fossils of birds that we have from the early part of the Cenozoic are somewhere close to the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. So that fossil bird that I showed you before, Phoropinarium, not the Wonderchicken, but the one that's related to those birds from Africa, that's a bird that comes from Wyoming. Obviously, in the present day, Wyoming in the winter gets far too cold for tropical fruit-dependent birds like turacos, which only live in sub-Saharan Africa, to survive in. But close to the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, we see evidence that many of these tropical groups were distributed at very high latitudes in the northern hemisphere. So on the contrary, we don't see evidence that the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum was associated with high levels of avian extinction, but it does seem to have played a major role in dictating the geographic distributions of these major groups of modern birds in the fossil record. So this is something that we're very interested in and have been working on over the last few years. Thank you. Okay, so Tom asks, it seems remarkable that feathers may first have evolved in distinctly flightless dinosaurs. Could you comment on that? It is remarkable, yet it's nonetheless true, because we know that feathers in their present day very complex form are not the earliest manifestation of feathers that we see in the fossil record. So the earliest forms of feathers that we see on small-bodied dinosaurs and other fossil archosaurs from the age of dinosaurs are almost more reminiscent of hair or sort of downy fuzz than a complex modern flight feather that we easily call to mind. So the evolutionary history of feathers throughout dinosaur evolutionary history is itself fascinating and a complex topic. But some work that we published just a few years ago shows that the acquisition of fully modern flight feathers, you just see, this is a bad example because we've got like a tail feather from a pheasant here, but it'll do. Fully modern flight feathers that are architecturally modern at a microscopic level evolved much later in bird evolutionary history than we ever knew before. And we think that the acquisition of these fully modern flight feathers does seem to correspond with the point in feathered dinosaur evolutionary history where we think more sophisticated powered flight itself would have originated. So feathers themselves did not originate in a flight relevant capacity, but it didn't take them very long, it seems, to be modified for aerodynamic purposes. Another great question. So Belinda asks, what about water birds when the asteroid hit? Wouldn't they have been protected from the forest fires and escaped, at least if they were ocean birds, not river birds? Yes, you're right. So that's a great question. In the latest part of the Cretaceous, I mentioned that those tree-dwelling opposite birds went extinct, probably because their forested habitats disappeared at that time. But there are important lineages of marine birds outside of modern bird diversity that were around and went extinct at that point in time too. So what happened to them? Well, in the oceans 66 million years ago, we see a catastrophic extinction as well, but it's a separate catastrophic extinction from what we see on land. In the oceans, we think that there was a general catastrophic shutdown of marine food webs, which manifested in the complete extinction of things like the giant marine lizards called mosasaurs, as well as plesiosaurs, as well as many other large-bodied groups of marine-dwelling vertebrates. And we think it's very likely that the disappearance of conspicuous late Cretaceous non-crown bird-like forms, things like relatives of Hesperornis and Ichthyornis, if you know about those, we think that their disappearance 66 million years ago was probably related to these catastrophic extinctions in the oceans related to the breakdown of marine food webs as opposed to deforestation. So you're right that this deforestation hypothesis does not explain the disappearance of all late Cretaceous bird-like forms. That's a great point. Jane Carmichael asks, does your fossil bird have teeth? It looks like it does. I can confirm that it does not have teeth. I've got a 3D print of the fossil here. This is twice life size. So the fossil itself is half as big as this. And the beak is toothless both on the upper jaw and the lower jaw. And in fact, the fact that Asteriornis is toothless is one of the features that allow us to recognize it as an early representative of crown group birds or modern birds. Okay, Melor asks, is there now a plan to do CT scanning of other ancient bird fossils? Do you have a good stock of fossils to investigate at Cambridge? Yes, so we are hard at work using these same sorts of digital techniques to study lots of other very interesting fossils from the end of the age of dinosaurs and the earliest stages of the Cenozoic. We've published sort of similar papers on the last few years looking at the anatomy and biology of some other key bird-like forms from the age of dinosaurs, like Ichthyornis, which was a toothed bird-like animal from the end of the age of dinosaurs. Not enough time to include that in the talk today, but yeah, we're doing our best to learn as much as we can about all of these bird-like forms from the age of dinosaurs and the Cenozoic. How do we determine the age of the fossil? Asks Jean. Well, Jean, the age of the fossil was determined because the fossil comes from rocks that are very well studied, that have been dated radiometrically using isotopic dating techniques. So those rocks from eastern Belgium and the southern part of the Netherlands are well known to be from the end of the age of dinosaurs, about 66 million years ago. And in fact, that particular locality where the fossil comes from is a really interesting, historically, very interesting fossil locality, because it is the initial place where rocks from the end of the age of dinosaurs were first recognized. So the town of Maastricht in the southern part of the Netherlands lends its name to the Maastricht Formation for the rocks there. And the Maastricht Formation lends its name to the Maastrichtian stage of the Cretaceous. So the Maastrichtian stage of the Cretaceous is the very end of the Cretaceous, and it's named in reference to these rocks themselves. So there are very few localities on Earth where we can be quite so confident that any fossil comes from the end of the age of dinosaurs. Jane Carmichael asks, how was the fossil found? The fossil was found by an amateur fossil collector named Martin van Dinther, who found those broken bones and donated them to the Natural History Museum in Maastricht in the Netherlands. So those bones sat in the museum for several years before I touched base with the curator at the Natural History Museum in Maastricht to look at another bird fossil that they had in their collections there. And he informed me about these really not very spectacular looking fossils. And that's the story. So we were interested in taking at least a quick look at these fossils, and those are the fossils that turned out to be the Wonderchicken. Peter asks, around Maastricht, were the expanses of water sweet or salty? These were marine rocks. So these were near shore sea sediments. We think the seas around there were relatively shallow. And a great model for that sort of environment is provided by the Bahamas in the present day. So we think it was sort of like a tropical beach-like environment. Barbara asks, where's the fossil and how long ago was it found? Well, the fossil is on display in the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences right now here at Cambridge. So please come down to the museum, book online, get your tickets, and check it out for free. How long ago was it found? I believe Martin van Dinther initially found the fossil in the year 2000, and it sat in the collections at the Natural History Museum there for 18 years before we studied it. Richard asks, does ground dwelling mean that the fossil bird flies? Not at all, flies a little, or flies a great deal? Well, it's hard to say for sure, but we think it probably flew. It's a small-bodied bird, and when we say ground dwelling, we don't mean flightless, we just mean a bird that doesn't live in trees for the most part. So we think that the surviving lineages of birds at the end of the age of dinosaurs were capable of flight. They simply were not predominantly tree-dwelling birds, and we think that same ecology was shared by this fossil. Sally asks, are there any hypotheses about the part that flight played in birds which survived the mass extinction? The answer is that I think it played a very, very important role, especially since we see such a rapid diversification of modern birds in the aftermath of the mass extinction event. And I think that's probably related to the dispersive capacity of birds to find greener pastures and basically colonize areas of the Earth that became colonizable over the years, decades, and centuries following the asteroid impact. At what point did annual migrations develop? Sally follows up with, that's a harder question to ask, and it's something that fossils can't really directly inform on quite the same way. Judith asks, any comments on the evolution of birds in New Zealand? Yes, it's a fascinating subject. New Zealand has been isolated from the rest of the world for a long time, since the age of dinosaurs. And over the last 80 or so million years, lineages of terrestrial vertebrates have repeatedly colonized New Zealand, including multiple lineages of birds that have arrived on New Zealand and evolved into very distinctive, really fascinating forms. The tragic thing about New Zealand is that so many of these endemic forms have either already been wiped out by humans over the last 1,000 years or so, or are at great risk of being wiped out in the coming years. So the extreme evolutionary distinctiveness of the New Zealand avifauna is something that really needs to be prioritized by governments and conservation agencies. Okay, I'm going to answer, I think, 2 more questions. And for anyone whose questions I'm not able to answer, please feel free to follow up and send me an email. You can look me up at Daniel Field, Cambridge. Okay, so Peter asks, how do these bird families migrate from their original continents to others right around the world? In the same way that birds disperse in the present day, I think that even rare dispersal events between different land masses, when you sort of marginalize across tens of millions of years, take place at some meaningful frequency. And if you think of bird watchers in the present day, every day, especially in this country, in the UK, bird watchers are excited when a new unexpected bird shows up on migration from North America or from Siberia, or in spring overshoots continental Europe. So birds get lost all the time. And I think that even rare, unlikely dispersal events, when you incorporate enough time, become less rare and less unlikely. Stuart asks, what influence does the paleo reconstruction of landmass distribution have on the fossil bird distribution? Not as much as you might think, simply because since we think that modern birds originated about 75 million years ago, although the continents have moved around a bit since then, most of the major land masses were essentially in their present day conformations. India, of course, is a counterexample. India went on a wild ride through the early stages of the Cenozoic, with important implications for the biodiversity of South Asia. But for the most part, continental breakup does not seem to have played a role in structuring the geographic distributions of modern birds, because modern birds are simply too young as a group to have been greatly influenced by continental breakup. Amanda asks, who is my colleague at the Bruce Museum in Connecticut? Daniel Sepka. Sepka is spelled K-S-E-P-K-A. He goes by Dan and I go by Daniel when we work together. He's a close colleague of mine and a good friend. He's the curator of science at the Bruce Museum, and he's a world expert on the fossil record of birds. And he did his PhD at the American Museum of Natural History, where you are in New York. Okay, so the last question I have time to answer now is from Tomasz, who says, you mentioned that species classification has changed a lot recently due to genetic analysis. If you look at online resources like Wikipedia, they seem to use a mixture of the old and new classification. What's the best resource for an up-to-date and consistent complete species tree of birds? Well, a complete species tree of birds is hard to find, but I will let you know that there are competing ideas on the evolutionary interrelationships of the major groups of birds in the present day. 2 important papers that attempt to bring us towards a more consistent understanding of how the major groups of birds are related to one another are a paper by Kimball, K-I-M-B-A-L-L, and colleagues that was published last year in a journal called Diversity. The nice thing about that paper is that it's a free online open access paper, so anyone can download it and read it. And the goal of that paper was to try to sort of build consensus around competing interpretations of the modern bird tree of life. And there's another important paper along those lines, which I don't think is open access, by Reddy and colleagues, R-E-D-D-Y, from 2017. That's published in the journal Systematic Biology. Thank you so much for all of your questions, and thank you for your attention over the last hour plus. It's been a privilege to talk to you about our work on the Wonderchicken. So thank you.